And I remember the Star decided to just put all of its reporting online for free. And I remember thinking what a mistake that was. We're giving away our work, which has taken time and money to create this content, and we're giving it away for free, and it won't be long before the public expectation is we can have that content for free. And sure enough, that happened. And now, the news organizations that are behind a paywall, they're challenged, well, why aren't you giving this, get rid of that paywall, why aren't you giving it for free? And it's hard to explain to people sometimes, you're paying for your coffee every morning or, whatever. You don't expect yourself or the people who are providing those services for you to do it for free. Journalism isn't free either.
Rick Westhead, thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here with you.
So in a few weeks, you're going to be doing something in London, Ontario, that's going to eat up an awful lot of your time. What is, for those of us who don't know the specifics of what's happening, what's going to be going on in the courtrooms there?
Well, it's going to be the latest development in a story that's captivated Canada and hockey for the last few years. A criminal trial will begin where 5 former members of Canada's 2018 World Juniors hockey team will be on trial for sexual assault.
So this is one of the things that I want to talk about. I want to talk about journalism and sports. And you're not the traditional guest that we would have. You don't have a real connection to Dubai and the UAE, but I still think it's incredibly worthwhile. Maybe just because I think it's incredibly worthwhile. So, and I'm going to call you on this. You said captivating. Has it captivated Canadian media's attention?
It might not be the best word. Shocked the Canadian public, for sure. But again, as we learn doing journalism, things that shock the public are often quickly forgotten because the news cycle moves on so fast. So I think that, a lot of Canadians, haven't thought about this case for some time. And when the trial does begin on April 22nd with jury selection, it's kind of bring it back into focus for them.
And what's happened leading up to this? If you can just give us a quick recap.
Sure. So this case has its roots, publicly anyways, in some reporting that we did at TSN in 2022, where we reported that a woman whose name was not revealed in court documents had sued Hockey Canada and 8 John Doe players, alleging that she'd been sexually assaulted following a golf and gala event in London, Ontario in the summer of 2018. And that lawsuit had been quickly settled, and that was all in our original reporting. The allegations were shocking and horrible and led to a real firestorm in Canada that at one point the Heritage Committee, a parliamentary committee in Ottawa, convened hearings and called Hockey Canada on the carpet and demanded answers and accountability and an explanation for how widespread this was. Were there other cases like this that the public did not know about? And it led to people at Hockey Canada losing their jobs. The public learned that the minor hockey fee registrations had been used to establish a slush fund to pay off people who had made allegations like this. And, the public had never been told about these funds in the past. And there was so much pressure that Hockey Canada and the London police, which originally had investigated this when the woman in the case went to police days after this alleged assault, because of all the public pressure, in 2022, the case was reopened both by London police and by Hockey Canada. And in January 2024, 5 players in this incident were charged criminally. And so it's been some time. If you think about it, this case has its roots in 2018. It's now 2025, and we're going to have a trial that's going to take about 2 months to find out whether or not they're convicted or not.
So I want to, 2 questions, grading system, and not on the bell curve. But if you were to grade Hockey Canada and their performance reaction to this, and then also Canadian media. Now, I haven't worked in Canadian media in a long time. You and I studied journalism at the same school. It turns out we just met for the first time a few days ago. We were there at the same time. But if you were to grade Canadian media for the coverage, because you've led the charge when it comes to this story. You're the one that's been consistently reporting on this before anyone else. How would you say the Canadian media as a whole has performed?
I think that this is seen as a sports story by many people, but it's not. So I would say, to be fair to people who cover sports, it can be intimidating, and many of them are unequipped to go into courthouses and pull court documents and start trying to lead coverage on a story like this, for sure, because they, on a daily basis, are going to team practices and covering games and doing feature stories like that. So this kind of reporting is not for everyone, for sure. But I think that, kind of looking back, it's fair to ask that question. I think that there's an opportunity to say, like, how could we have done this better? And not just for other reporters, even for me. Like, we at TSN, we're always doing kind of autopsies on big stories, whether it's this story or the Canada soccer story with the use of drones at the Olympics. And after the fact, asking, like, where did we do this well, and where could we have done better on this? So, broadly speaking, the media didn't do a great job, to be candid, but I think Hockey Canada absolutely gets a failing grade for how it responded. Very defensive, pushed back immediately, saying they had done nothing wrong. In fact, when we first started the reporting on this, Hockey Canada insisted that woman in this case, that they had settled this, lawsuit and not gone forward because she didn't want that she didn't go to police. Well, that wasn't true. So this wound up costing some of the most senior leaders at Hockey Canada their jobs because of that.
Do you think, because it got to the floor of Parliament, do you think that if Canadian politicians hadn't pushed to find answers, that Hockey Canada would have just gone on business as normal?
I think that it was a really good example of the power both of a government and politicians who are invested in something like that parliamentary committee was, and as well in the power of journalism. It wasn't just TSN that was leading the charge on this. The Globe and Mail reported first that Hockey Canada had this secret slush fund that it was using with minor hockey registrations. And when they made that reporting public, it outraged Canadians who were asking the question, like, how can this happen? Surely it's a good idea to have a fund to pay people who've been hurt, but how do you justify not being transparent about that? And how do you justify hiding that and not including in your annual report the fact that that fund exists and the fact that you've been charging parents across the country to build up that fund?
Now, we met after I was playing hockey at Dubai Mall. We have a mutual friend who was also playing hockey, and it brings up an interesting question to me. We're both in our 50s, both played hockey. Do you think of the big four traditional North American sports, where does hockey rate as far as being the most liberal or the most conservative?
Yeah, there's been some interesting market research on this by a company called Morning Consult in the United States, and they looked at each of the major professional sports leagues, the demographics of the fans, and Morning Consult found that the National Hockey League's fans tend to be the most white of any in North America in sports, and the most right-leaning as well, mirroring perhaps the ownership suite in the National Hockey League. Very Republican, very wealthy, and very white.
And that doesn't obviously start when they become professional. That starts from a very early age. And so in general, do you think that there is, and we can talk about your book that's coming out later this year, but do you think that there is that culture within hockey that needs to change? And does it, as a North American, it doesn't matter if you're Canadian or American when it comes to that conservative element that exists in the sport?
Boy, this is a kind of a powder keg of a subject for people in Canada because, for years, we hockey has this, and you'd know this, hockey has a place in our society that is almost unrivaled.
Well, and let me just stop you there. We can look at, it was just yesterday that the Prime Minister called the election, and part of leading up to that election was that he was out with the Edmonton Oilers practicing, and he has that commercial with Mike Myers where they're, standing right by the boards. Hockey is part of who we are, for good or for bad.
It is. And so when you start to drill down and you find some parts of the sport that are troubling, it's understandable why you might not want to do that, because if you're, as a person, as a country even, you so closely identify with the sport, what does it say about you as a country or as people when things like this have been systemic and allowed to continue? It reminds me a little bit of the Spotlight story in Boston. And in 2002, the editor of the Boston Globe, who was new to the job, assigned some of his reporters, 4 or 5 reporters, to look into the case of a Catholic priest who had been accused of abusing children. And their reporting, led to them finding out that it wasn't actually one priest, that there was, more than a dozen priests, and every day brought new leads and brought more stories. But they were doing the reporting against the backdrop of a paper that was in a community that had such a close-knit tie to the Catholic Church. It had so much power. And so as the reporters were doing their work, they, even within their own newsroom, were getting pushback. Well, why do you have to challenge the church like this? Why can't you focus on the good stories within the church? Look at all the good things that the church does. But the truth is, for decades, those were the only stories that were being told, were all about the good that was being done. And these stories, which were important and needed to be told, weren't. Partially because of self-censorship, partially because the church had done a really good job in, making sure that those stories weren't told. And so, of course, that reporting led to, the Globe opening people's eyes. It was an international scandal. It became the basis for the Oscar-winning movie Spotlight years later. And I think there's a really interesting parallel between that story and the Hockey Canada story. Not necessarily, I'm not saying that the abuse in hockey is as widespread as it was in the Catholic Church that was reported. We don't know how widespread it is, right? Because for the last 100 years in Canada, we focus on all the good guys, all the good stories in hockey. And that is what we like to hear because it makes us feel good about the game. It makes us feel good about ourselves. And when we hear stories like Sheldon Kennedy, who was abused in the late 1990s and went public with his story, we don't want to think about that. And we don't want to ask questions about whether there really was change after, he came forward, and whether that change has sustained or whether there's still deep-rooted problems in the game.
So have you received, I don't want to say threats, that's too strong a word, but have you received responses from people within the hockey community who say, oh, Rick, just let it go?
Of course.
Yeah. Really?
Of course. I've received direct messages, again, suggesting I'm trying to ruin the sport. Why can't I focus on more good news stories?
Is this from people within the hockey community, or is this like parents or friends?
This is everyone. It's people within the hockey community. It's anonymous people on social media. It's in one way, like in terms of social media, we could talk for a long time about the dangers of social media. Social media is not real, right? These are not, at least that's not how I see it. When you're getting a comment from someone who doesn't have the courage to put their real name and identity next to what they're saying, it's automatically meaningless to me. I'm held accountable for my reporting because my byline is on every story. So why would I give a second's thought to somebody who doesn't have the courage of their convictions to put their name, next to what they want to say? So I really restrain myself. I've taken Twitter or X off my phone, so I don't have the temptation to look at it nearly as much. It's still a tool I use for work, but I'm on it less than I've ever been on it before. And I mean, in terms of people in the hockey world, saying this, well, I don't hate hockey. I love hockey. I play hockey twice a week. In fact, I love it so much that I'm willing to go to these places and ask these uncomfortable questions and, be unpopular in a certain part of the sport because it's that important. How can we, if we know that kids are being hurt, what does it say about us if we decide just to look the other way and not do anything about it?
So on the other side, have you also received what I hope is the majority of the comments, people saying, keep going, you're doing good work?
Yeah, I get both. I get support and I get criticism. But again, that's journalism, isn't it? Right? You're not going to make everyone happy doing your job.
Which brings another interesting point. You and I both did the newspaper stream at Ryerson TMU. And do you think, and I know we're new media right now and you do a lot of broadcast media. Do you think, and maybe this is too praiseworthy of how we started, but do you think a story like this would have come about if not for the skills that you developed as a newspaper reporter?
Good question. I think that those skills are so important. And when I appreciate opportunities like this to talk about how we do our jobs, because the vast number of people don't know how we do our jobs. I think there's an assumption that when you're doing reporting, you find something out from someone and you immediately throw it on social media to be first. And one of the things that, the team of us at TSN do together, we get a tip, and the first thing we do is talk about whether this reporting is in the public interest. Does it meet the standard? And we have to do that because, I'm actually not out there looking for stories that are quote unquote bad about hockey. They're coming to me every day in tips. And, even saying they're bad about hockey, well, they're bad from the perspective that someone is not going to want it reported, but is it bad for somebody who's never had a voice, who's been hurt by a coach or an official or a player? Is it bad to give them a voice? It's not comfortable, that's for sure. But I don't know that these stories are necessarily bad. Anyway, once we determine if it's in the public interest, then it takes weeks and months sometimes to do the reporting. It's going back. It's asking for more documentation from people who are bringing us a story. It's challenging them on their memory. It's comparing what they say in the first interview to the second or third or fourth interviews. It's asking for corroborating witnesses who can share their perspective on it. It's having all the different members at TSN who are my editor, colleague, and then my boss, and then our lawyers. They all have to have time to look at these stories. And then when it's finally done, we need to be able to give the person we're writing about a fair opportunity to respond. So it's going to them and explaining exactly what we're going to report in detail and giving them a deadline, a fair deadline, and telling them if they need more time to consider a response, we'll be reasonable as best as we can. So it's a very time-consuming exercise to do it right. And if you're doing stories and reporting like this that can change people's lives when their names are mentioned, that's the bare minimum. You have to do that. So, I think people who come into journalism today, there are really talented reporters, really talented writers. But I don't think the one thing that has changed, and there's so much about our business that's changed, but the one thing that cannot change, is the amount of time that you have to be committed to do this kind of reporting.
And you work at TSN, which is a sports network. But as we've talked about just a few moments ago, you don't cover a lot of games. Your job is the people that are involved in those games, and sometimes good stories, sometimes bad stories. Do you think, though, that there is enough news organizations in Canada are spending, we're both Canadian, so I'm going to talk about Canada, are spending resources on these sorts of issues that might be controversial, but if we're going to grow as a society, are essential?
I mean, no. I think I'd love to see more media in Canada. One of the things I remember, those moments in time that stand out. I was a reporter at the Toronto Star, and I remember when this Toronto Star website began. I've been in the business, I guess, quite a while. And I remember the Star decided to just put all of its reporting online for free. And I remember thinking what a mistake that was. And I'm at a town hall, and I'm one of these people who would stand at the very back of a town hall usually and never ask a question. But in this one moment, I do remember putting my hand up and saying, I think this is a mistake. We're giving away our work, which has taken time and money to create this content, and we're giving it away for free, and it won't be long before the public expectation is we can have that content for free. And sure enough, that happened. And now, the news organizations that are behind a paywall, they're challenged, well, why aren't you giving this, get rid of that payroll, why aren't you giving it for free? And it's hard to explain to people sometimes, you're paying for your coffee every morning or, whatever. You don't expect yourself or the people who are providing those services for you to do it for free. Journalism isn't free either.
In fact, I'd go one step further and I'd say you're paying for the newspaper. But this is what I used to say at the end of the last century when I started out, is that so if I want the newspaper, I have to get dressed, go down to the corner store, and pay for it. But the other option is to just stay in my pajamas and read it for free online. And I am in agreement with you. It's never made sense. So let me ask you this. You and I are in charge of newspapers or media in Canada. What's the solution? So that, because we both entered at a time when there were a lot of options. The National Post in Canada had just launched when I started into it. Of course, there was the Sun, the Star, the Globe and Mail, and then of course the broadcast. Social media hadn't even started. So if you were in charge of, let's just go with newspapers for now, because I think that's where the real, for me, I'm biased, but the real work is essential. What is it that you would do so that the industry is going to thrive for another 100 years?
I don't know if I have the only answer, but one thing that I would do if I was in a position to run a newsroom and mentor young journalists would be to challenge them to not follow the crowd.
Journalism.
If there is a press conference, don't go. And it's fine. If you're going to miss a story that the wires have, and if, a politician's having a press conference, chances are the Associated Press or Reuters or Canadian Press is going to be there. That's fine. And because if you go, your story ostensibly is going to be the same as everybody else's. You might have some different quotes or you might write it in a different way, but the facts are going to be relatively the same. I would rather see young reporters committed to finding their own stories that are unique. And, I think that is what makes the reporting at TSN that we've done over the last 10 years special, as we've done work that no one has done. And it's not all bad news stories. Like, I also would tell reporters, humanize people. One of the things that I love doing are stories, and maybe the public doesn't think of me for this because the stories on hockey misconduct are so high profile and so jarring. But I love doing stories that humanize athletes. One of my favorite stories in the last months was a profile on a soccer player for Canada's national soccer team named Stefan Eustachio. And I built up a relationship with him over months by going to games and practices and, building his trust, earning his trust. And Stefan shared with me that before the World Cup that Canada qualified for in Qatar, he'd had an agreement with his parents when Canada qualified that his parents were going to come and watch him play for Canada for the first time ever. Stefan's family was from Portugal. They moved to Ontario when he was very young. His father returned to Europe for work, and Stefan stayed with his brother, Mauro, and their mother. And she raised them ostensibly as a single parent in Ontario, taking them to practices and tryouts and doing it all on her own. And so he was so excited to be able, for his mother, to see him play for Canada in the national team uniform for the first time. And weeks before the World Cup, his friend in Portugal calls and said, something's going on with your mom. Her balance is off. We need to get her to see a doctor. So they get her in to see a doctor, and it turns out that she has terminal brain cancer. And so Stefan plays the World Cup without telling anyone this news. His parents obviously can't come to Qatar. His mom's in treatment. She winds up dying months after the World Cup. And almost immediately after her passing, he talks to me about how important it was to watch his daughter being born and to, receive a new life into the world. And during the interview, you could see the emotion play out because he really hadn't talked about this before. And he was so raw and so authentic in both the pain and grief that he was feeling for his mother and the appreciation that he had for her, doing all these things that this great mom did for her boys to help them chase a dream, but then also to pivot to the joy that he felt being a new dad and, filming with him and his daughter and his partner. What an amazing privilege to be able to go to Portugal and film with this, high-profile Canadian athlete who was telling a story that hadn't been told before, that hit him so close to home and gave him a chance to, in a public way, pay tribute to his mom. I would love it if I was only doing those stories, because you can't do them and not feel something, right? And when we're at our best as journalists, we're making people feel something, a connection. So, the Hockey Canada reporting, it's important, it has to be done, and so we do it. But the stuff that really gets me excited are those other stories like Stefan Eustachio and people trusting in you to tell you the story of how they've overcome and what their family's been through. And there's lots of those stories out there too. So I would, if I'm running the paper, I would be having my reporters try to do both of those at the same time and go and carve their own paths.
And this is one of the, correct me if I'm wrong, you've been doing it, the sports reporting much longer than I have and more in depth. But I think that traditionally some of the best writers at a newspaper come out of the sports department because they're able to do that, where it's the combination of taking the facts, the team lost or won, with telling the story. And I remember I had a sports editor at the National Post who we talked about, Graham Parley. And one person in particular, I can remember this like it was yesterday, where he was speaking with Chris Jones. And Chris was going out to cover a Blue Jays game. Now, you're covering the home team that's 81 games a year. They can become pretty similar. And Graham had said, because Chris was starting out, Graham had said, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you're covering a little bit of what's on the field, but you're also turning around and looking at the spectators. And he ended up doing a story about, I think it was a game where they were firing off hot dogs or T-shirts or something out of one of these, mobile sort of launchers. And it ended up becoming, I think, a turning point for Chris in the way that he could recognize a story, because it wasn't just about, to your point, what everybody was covering, which was the game and the score. And I think it's one of the things that the National Post did really well is they started to cover things a little bit differently. And I'm not going to say that they were doing exactly what you're saying, where they were covering people, but there was a slightly different slant to the coverage in the sports department. And that, I think, helped give the paper in those first couple of years a little bit of something that maybe the Globe and Mail launched. And I think since a lot of other media outlets have sort of changed gear, and what we're talking about is standard practice, I think. I know where I was most recently, all our competitors would cover everything up on the podium. And we would always turn and who's there at whatever that event is. Yes, it's big, and we'll cover that off with a couple of hundred words in an 800-word story. But the bigger story will be for us the story that not everyone is talking about.
It reminds me a little bit of the story. I can't remember what the writer's name is, but when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, I remember one of the stories in the days after that stands out was a profile of the gravedigger. So as everyone else was, following, in a crowd of hundreds of reporters, as his casket was taken by and his son saluted and all those images that we remember. One of the reporters thought, you know what, I'm going to go to the grave. At Arlington. I'm going to try to interview the man who's digging Kennedy's grave. Just a different way to think about a story. And then you see it and you think, oh, well, why didn't I think of that? What a great idea. What a great angle. Very different.
I think with, I've worked with a lot of journalists out here, and I look for 4 qualities. The first one is being trustworthy, so that, the proper journalism approach where what you've written is yours, and if it's not, you've attributed it. But the second is being creative. And I think here in the UAE, where it's not, the traditional free press as it is in other countries, you're always having to come up with interesting ideas because you constantly have to feed, the beast that is the website and the newspaper, right? So if you are in a position where you can constantly be thinking of creative ideas that the competition's not going to have, or maybe you're all going to the same big event, but you're consistently coming up with something that's a little bit like the gravedigger, right? Something that's a little bit unique. I think it helps to set your brand apart and your personal brand, but also, the news organization you're working for.
Yeah, and you hit on it perfectly. Ideas are, that is our product, right? We're only as good as our next idea. Like I know myself, and I know that as I'm working on stories, they'll take months sometimes, and I'm in it, and I think it's so important, and I know it's going to be in the public interest, and it's going to affect change and hold the powerful accountable. Then the story gets published, and then I go into this anxiety feeling because I'm wondering, what's my next story going to be?
So that takes me to another issue that I want to talk about is your books. So you've published one a few years ago, and you have another one that's coming out November, October?
Right.
And when you're going through that, because I've never written one, but I've heard so many other people talk about the worst experience of my life or the greatest experience of my life, or it's the greatest 6 months after it was the worst. How difficult is it to live, especially for this new book that's coming out, which is about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the culture of hockey? How difficult is it to live with that for, I guess it's been a year or two for you? Yeah,
it's never ending because you're always trying to think, is this as good as it can possibly be? How do I make that chapter better? Does this flow work right? I know my strengths. I'm a good reporter. My writing is the part that I need to work on the most. I find that so difficult, writing, and I see other writers, competitors, Bruce Arthur at the Star, like Cahal Kelly at the Globe, and I just think, man, what a gift these people have. I'd love to have that, but it does. It's consuming. I'm waking up middle of the night. I'm thinking, okay, well, how can I make that better? Who else should I talk to? Do I have enough voices here? Especially for a book like this. It's called, the one that's coming out in November is called We Breed Lions, Confronting Canada's Troubled Hockey Culture. And I think it's important. It's going to kind of capture, and again, the perspectives in this book are not necessarily mine. I'm giving a platform to former and current junior hockey players, team owners, scouts, coaches, parents, to have their say about what they think about the state of the game. And it's important to get that right.
So they talk about the state of the game, and I'm curious, I guess a 2-part question. First, the people you interview, and then you. Does anybody make any recommendations about how the situation can change? And do you have any recommendations, if you could?
I'm glad you asked me that. The book is pretty sobering, and it was important that it not only be this critical lens look at hockey, because there are good people in the game, make no mistake. So the last chapter of this book is about a path forward, and it's spotlighting different teams, organizations, minor hockey, junior hockey, that I think could be a model for others. Where at least they're making an attempt. They've got the self-awareness to say, we need to do better than we've done, and we're going to try to do this in a different way.
Now, I have twins, boy and a girl. They're 28. They're back in Toronto. My daughter, both my kids learned how to play hockey here in the UAE. My daughter played on the national team for a little bit. And it just makes me think that with the growth of women's hockey in Canada especially, but the professional league, do you think that that will have an impact on Hockey Canada, on the NHL, on the culture that exists? Because when it no longer is just the guys where they have to, maybe the mothers are more involved, maybe the sisters are more involved, wives, girlfriends. Do you think that that will have an impact on what it is that the guys are doing wrong?
Oh, for sure. I think that one of the reasons that we keep seeing the same mistakes happening over and over again is because, if you look back through history, there's a hockey player who plays junior, and then the hockey player plays pro, and then he retires, and then he becomes a scout, and then he works for a team in junior, and then maybe graduates to coaching or managing at the pro level.
I would also then add, gets fired by 3 or 4 teams, but keeps getting hired.
Right. So, these men, have often said when they have heard about things that have happened on their teams, well, I went through that and it was worse for me, so what's the big deal?
Right.
Right? Because it's easier to do that and just to be dismissive of it as opposed to confronting this, right? Remember, this is a business. So if you're a junior team and you have a prominent player on your team who's accused of misconduct, well, if you bring this to a head and make that public, it may hurt that player's potential to be drafted high and to become a professional. And if you're a junior team, you get paid more money for a player. You get paid more money by the National Hockey League team that drafts him based on where he's selected in the draft. So you have a financial disincentive to actually hold players accountable publicly for what they might do. I think it's a great thing that we've got the PWHL, Professional Women's League. Not just that league, though. You now have the WNBA coming to Toronto. You have a new pro women's soccer league in Canada. And all this is great because it's more competition. And the lifeblood of professional sports is money and sponsorships. And so if you are a Canadian Tire or a Tim Hortons or an Air Canada, who do you want to partner with? You're going to want to partner with a team or a league that's going to enhance your brand's reputation, not hurt it. And so what that means is for junior teams and leagues on the men's side, with this new competition, you have to do better. Because if you don't, you're going to lose sponsors, you're going to lose fans to other leagues and sports that are doing it better, that are offering a different, more progressive approach.
So you talk about sponsorships. As a result of what happened and what the trial is going to hopefully unearth over the course of the next few weeks, did Hockey Canada end up losing a fair number of sponsors or any sponsors?
They all walked away. Some of them have come back. But Canadian Tire, for instance, it's no longer associated with Hockey Canada. It's decided to go more grassroots hockey, PWHL. So this is the risk, is, you don't confront these issues and you don't get it right and you don't build up policies that are the right ones. When something bad does happen, and again, there's always going to be people in sports, just like there are in every walk of life, that are trying to take advantage, right? And so, I wouldn't fool myself to think, we can never get to a point where this never happens again. You hear that phrase a lot. We have to make sure this never happens again. It's going to happen again. Sheldon Kennedy was sexually assaulted by his junior hockey coach in the mid-'90s. It's happened again. It happened as recently as 2010 when Kyle Beach was sexually assaulted by his coach with the Chicago Blackhawks. And there have been numerous instances between those two. So this will keep happening in the future. The question is, are we doing everything we can to learn from each of those incidents, to make the policies of reporting allegations, safeguarding kids, and holding people accountable, and advising the public and being transparent about it when these things happen? That's the question. Can we do better on each of those?
So you mentioned Kyle Beach. Again, your reporting led, I think, the way when it came to properly explaining to the public exactly what happened there. And I think it also pressured the NHL and the Blackhawks into hopefully doing what was right. But with that, do you think that, and we have an assistant coach who is a woman with the Utah team, do you think, or is it the Seattle team, one or the other, do you think that we'll get to the point where there will be more women who are in leadership positions? And I know the Leafs have done a pretty good job of bringing in women in senior positions. I don't know how much interaction they have with the players. And I wonder if by the time you get to the NHL, if maybe it's a little bit too late. But do you think that there'll be more of that integration, women into the sport? Or do you think that the guys just have to figure it out on their own?
I hope there's more integration. You mentioned the Toronto Maple Leafs. They brought Haley Wickenheiser in on staff. When you look at the 60 major junior hockey teams across Canada and the United States, why aren't there more women in leadership positions working as general managers? They know the game. One of the criticisms that I'll hear is, well, you never played. You must have been cut from a team or something like this. Well, forget about the fact that that's childish. There's a lot of women who have played, right? And it might not be exactly the same game that you see in the National Hockey League or Major Junior Hockey, but there's a lot of smart minds out there who know this game. And if I was an owner of a junior team, I would want to be bringing them in. I would think that that could give me a competitive advantage to bring in some of the women who have been overlooked up until now.
I also think that the role that parents are playing or need to play, I think parents need to be a little bit more inquisitive of what's going on, not just on the ice. I'm a goalie, maybe I didn't play very well. Maybe my mother or father's going to tell me that. But also, like, how are things going on in the dressing room? And I think the dressing room is the key, because I think the conversations that take place there are very telling. This morning, for instance, it was mostly about, the Canadian election that was just called for yesterday. And I think that in the dressing room, there's a culture that exists. Retired players talk about it. When they leave the game, they don't necessarily talk about missing on ice. They miss the dressing room, the camaraderie. And I think my question to you is, what is the role you think that, based on the research that you've done for your book, that parents are going to have to do when it comes to trying to understand more about what's going on in the dressing room?
It's a critical part. And in that, I mentioned the last chapter of this book is a path forward. And one of the things that I do is drill down on a minor hockey organization that's trying to do it differently and trying to reach young players, 9, 10, 11 years old, and help them understand, a better path, as opposed to the kinds of conversations that maybe we've come to think are typical of men's hockey dressing rooms.
Yeah, I think, I look back to when I was younger and playing and wanting a different career. And my father coached me for many years. But what he would say to me, I would never say, and I've never said to my son or to my daughter. And I think that there is, in 2025, we have so much more knowledge about what's right and what's wrong, and what's good and what's healthy. And I think that as a society, we somehow need to understand that there has to be, a better way forward. And my hope is that, through books like the one that you've written, we will get to that point. And to bring it full circle, when you talk about what you've written about, and when you talk about what's going to be going on in the next few weeks in London, do you know that there will be a lot of media coverage beyond just you attending the trial?
I don't know for sure, but I would assume that there will be. It's tough to predict because will be when the trial begins, it's going to coincide with the federal election. So that will be sucking up a lot of newsroom resources and energy. But it's still a really high-profile case. And, I would imagine that sports networks are going to cover it very closely, for sure.
Yeah.
Both U.S., Canadian, maybe some outside of North America as well.
Rick Westhead, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.